I'm Will Payne with SMBW, and we're really excited to interview Tyler Silvestro with Marvel. He's a landscape architect with that group, and it's really good to meet you, Tyler. And I'm excited to have this conversation today. So, so I think at a high level, I wanted to just start with asking about your work and background in landscape architecture. What got you into it, and what you're interested in now?
My name is Tyler. I'm a partner with Marvel and a landscape architect licensed here in Virginia and New York and Pennsylvania. Um, I'd say I came to the field of landscape architecture through kind of a slightly different path. A lot of folks I know, especially in grad school, have a penchant for plants and they come to landscape architecture because they want to continue to understand the texture and kind of composition of plants in terms of creating a space or a garden. Um, and I do love that aspect of it very much. Have dove quite deeply into the plant world, into the ecology world, and plant compositions. But prior to going into landscape architecture, I was working with a civil engineering firm and I kind of dabbled in the surveying world. So I actually came at it from the lens of kind of property, um, site plans and extents, and then soils. So I'd say I arrived at landscape architecture through the ground up, where I was learning a lot more about how soil works, how water moves within the ground, um, groundwater infiltration, and then of course all of the pieces that we see on top of the surface, the buildings, the parking lots, the playgrounds, the parks, how all of that impacts the soils and vice versa. So when I came to landscape architecture, it was really through wanting to have a deeper understanding as to how soils kind of made up the ground we walk on. But then it just grew from there.
So I think that kind of parlays into my next question, which is where landscape does hit the surface. Aside from plants, like what role do you see landscape and green space playing in the design and planning of urban spaces?
Where landscape meets the ground is kind of where our understanding of landscape architecture begins, but also where public realm exists, where country roads lead, um, where building foundations are laid. It's really like this beautiful tapestry and composition of all these different materials, whether they be kind of man-made, planned, designed, drawn, or not at all. And I prefer the landscape designs that feel like they've been there, that don't feel like they've been kind of heavily superimposed on the earth, but ones where there's been really deep consideration for things such as how pavers feel under your foot, how they affect and impact the microclimate, how they do work in terms of texture and composition with plantings, with view sheds, with sight lines. Um, so I guess to answer your question, thinking about landscape architecture as a discipline, it really does impact the urban environments in a myriad ways. Of course, there are public parks and plazas, but there are also streets and sidewalks. And I have a feeling, I feel that architects and landscape architects are uniquely suited to just kind of consider the way something as pedestrian as a sidewalk works and doesn't work, and have a you know opinion on it, be it through a design contract or just in general to share as activists in terms of how to make cities kind of not just appear better, but to work better for people outside of a car and people who prefer to live inside of dense urban environments such as myself.
What that makes me think about is sort of a broader idea of what green space means in the city with regards to it functioning as like connective tissue in the city, you know, and yes, that it overlaps with sidewalks and bike paths and things of that nature. And so I think that to me begs a question of one of equity and the role that landscape architecture can play in providing an equitable experience for everyone in a city. And and I think like the way in which we go about doing that is sometimes might feel kind of obvious and sometimes is really subtle. And I'm curious your thoughts about the idea of landscape and green space as like how can it contribute or make equitability more difficult in the city.
Environmental justice and equitable public spaces and private spaces are kind of top of mind, um, particularly in cities. Uh, I should note that Marvel is a firm that's kind of steeped historically in New York City and also Puerto Rico and Old San Juan. And I think that as a firm, we have a unique kind of perspective on this issue because those are two places that share a tale of two cities. New York City, you have to kind of see where the funding is coming from for various projects. Um, Certain types of projects are funding very high dollar projects that aim to become pristine and heavily maintained and heavily managed and become a place that maybe doesn't appear to be equitable or it doesn't really appear to be for everyone. Um, and then you have spaces also in New York City that were designed around the whole theory of equitable and democratic nature, such as Central Park and Prospect Park. These public green spaces were, yes, a refuge from that era of various kind of illnesses and ailments such as cholera, but they were also places just to get fresh air, and they did not exclude anyone. There were no rules against who can use the park. Um, but today, and I bring up San Juan as another example because, again, people go to San. There are millions of residents on the island of Puerto Rico, um, and yet it seems to be, from the outside eye, a place of destination, recreation, and a resort. So those are spaces that therefore occupy the beaches, which should be public, but kind of take space back. And so those are not equitable landscapes at all. They're resorts. Yeah, they're pay to play. And I guess one concern I have in general is the idea of pay to play and the monetization of public spaces in general. So I don't like to do projects like that. I try to steer away from that. It's actually one of the reasons why I feel very comfortable in Richmond and with the folks I've worked with in Virginia so far have been really great and also share that idea that public spaces are truly for everyone and that even in the planning process and the design process of public spaces, you'll hear voices who think that a certain type of program shouldn't be allowed or we don't want to invite this type of activity. But it seems like almost anathema or counterintuitive to the city of Richmond, where public spaces are generally kind of very ad hoc and open to any use that people find kind of their interest at the time, for better or worse. But it's what it is, and I like to think that landscapes evolve on their own, and they're not designed to be used in the way that they were designed forever, that they evolve and adapt. And so I'm a big proponent of an evolving landscape and one that serves not just the people who need to use it today, but kind of an infinite number of users or experiences in the future.
So I actually want to take it back to some of what you first said about how sort of the functioning of soil, like the civil background, the surveying, and brush on a discussion about plants. But what I'm thinking about is, the challenge we have as designers in taking a space that we think, oh, if we just did this, it could be a great public space or whatever. And we design it for everybody, but inherently in doing that, you know, it's easy to take something that feels accessible by everybody and suddenly becomes exclusive because it's too nice. And I think the question I have is with regards to like, are there things we can do with like native plantings and things that are less imposed on the landscape that have more of a sense of having been here a long time as a way not to design and a form of style in terms of something having been here a long time, but in terms of utilizing what sort of naturally does occur, specifically in the landscape as a way to think about equity.
Yeah, I take that question to be more in terms of the equity in terms of input and resources. Native plantings are a great catch-all term for wanting to do right by your locale. Um, but locales are compromised, especially in cities where most everything that we see has been moved or shifted or taken down or rebuilt, including the plant ecologies and the plant communities. So it's in terms of the evolving nature of landscape, plant selection is always changing. Um, and there are folks who we really like to work with who are absolute experts at this, and I encourage all landscape architects and architects when the chance arises to seek a horticulturist, either through a local university or professionally, just to get input on what it is that we are trying to do. Um, Native plants are tough. Honestly, it's such a great topic, and it's so big that it far exceeds the knowledge base of a landscape architect, at least this landscape architect. But the idea of using native plants is the idea centered around reclaiming some sort of version of Arcadia that we have displaced, some portion of the North American prairie systems and the riverine ecologies that we've compromised with something that feels that is more appropriate. Um, and when I say about landscape performance, what I guess I mean is the act of maintenance is an energy input that we maybe don't need to do as much of if we plan and kind of execute planting correctly.
That's sort of how I think about it, is that it's something that will be more something closer to being self-sustaining than something that is
Mm-hmm.
highly manicured, that requires a lot of maintenance, that inherently requires ongoing costs, and what sort of exclusiveness comes with environments like that.
It also points to poop those who can work in a public space and you work with a, let's say, a municipal kind of parks department. They only have a certain amount of bandwidth to maintain plant life, which requires input, requires selection of weeds, the kind of deselection of unwanted plants or species, um, just general overall maintenance and pruning, and then of course watering. Public parks don't typically have a budget for these kinds of things, whereas other more privatized public spaces do, which makes them more desirable. And you could probably think of a list of 10 off the top of your head right now locally in Richmond that do this and do it really well. But those spaces also tend to feel less natural. Like the native plants in those spaces feel more um, like a clipped garden than they do a public space or a what a colleague, what a collaborator of ours, Thomas Rainier and Claudia West from FIDO would call a post-wild planting in a post-wild world. That's a little plug for them because they are incredible, and you should all seek them out. But that's the work they do, and it's intentional not to try to make everything look like it's performing to its best because it tends to skew into the territory of overly maintained or petted or manicured when landscapes should really return to their kind of more wild versions of themselves. But that takes expertise.
How long have you been in Richmond?
Basically, this month in 2021, so about 3 years.
An interesting time, sort of coming out of the pandemic. Um, what changes have you seen in Richmond since you've been here?
I feel the change that I wasn't here to physically experience, but I feel it through conversations and just general and having an office downtown. Um, I guess I feel the removal of the monuments, that was a big shift in Richmond's cultural. significance and awareness. Its kind of cultural cachet outside of Richmond. You know, folks who know me who ask about Richmond almost always ask about it. So I feel like that's something I didn't like I said didn't experience but felt it. We kind of got here when the Lee Memorial was coming down, and I don't know. I guess my optimistic self thinks that I've seen a lot of positivity in terms of an approach to kind of a more open, transparent kind of process of planning and zoning initiatives. And I feel like those initiatives are ones that I am in favor of, but also just interested in seeing how they evolve. And this goes from everything from architectural zoning, code, and density to multimodal transportation and new routes for free fare bus rides. Um, I think these are all positive things for the life of a city dweller, and stuff that I think are happening kind of as we speak. And then various other small area plans being adopted, which I think when you look at the patchwork of that, that's one thing. But when you look at it holistically and you think about what the impacts could be 5, 10, 20 years down the road, that there are some potential, like really great and positive initiatives that are ongoing. And then a shout out to the tree people. I'd say that there's been a tidal wave of tree stewardship and citizenship, be they volunteer pruners or planters or watering people who want to water trees or adopt trees. Um, it's been crazy, and I've been in kind of discussions with some of the nonprofits who do tree plantings, and each year it multiplies like exponentially in terms of the interest in getting more trees in the ground. Um, and I think a lot of that stems from people's just general awareness of the climate, but also just the enjoyment of trees and understanding where pieces of the city severely lack them and understand the reasons why. That there's this kind of correction, and I won't even call it an overcorrection, just a correction of the amount of tree canopy that the city is aiming to provide. And I'm in favor of that and hopeful that that's going to continue.
That comes up a lot for us too. Often in the context of we can't put a building here without doing something with trees that people want to keep, and it's often a challenge. And there's typically a mitigation that happens with regards to what what we need to do in order to achieve what our as an architect what our clients are trying to achieve. And so it comes up often. We're thinking about consistent tree canopy in the city in a thoughtful way. There there should be a master plan for that. I'm thinking out loud, but like there should be a master plan for what the tree canopy should look like in the city, and like what's the so to open up the question a little bit, what do you see as being in the way of making something like that happen?
The master plan for the trees, or the urban forestry master plan, is forthcoming and will probably be out honestly as a procurement before this airs. But that's kind of already in the pipeline. I think we'll find out more about the various roadblocks once that happens. But the fact that that is going to be something that the city has backed and is working to fund is one of those barriers that's about to get broken. It's That's a big one, and it's been there for a long time. And then in terms of where trees go, this will all get sussed out hopefully in that urban forestry master plan, because it won't. I think it'll be less about where we physically put them one by one, but what regions of the city are sorely lacking them in terms of their overall canopy. And I think it's going to look more holistically and through data as to where trees could go, where trees are lacking, and then identifying the resources that can help achieve those canopy goals. Because that's the other thing that's really interesting about Richmond is this entire kind of pool of nonprofit organizations who are in line with this idea, that they both are actively grant writing pretty constantly throughout the year. They're funding various projects that do want to kind of just put a couple trees on a street or replace an entire kind of understory of an entire urban park. like those folks are out there doing that work right now, and that's really heartening. And then with the help from the city, hopefully through this master plan process, that there'll be a really good kind of 2 to 3 prong approach as to how do we get like a really active and healthy tree ecosystem, both underway, but also the one we have now to be kind of maintained and protected.
When you look sort of holistically at initiatives throughout the city, whether that be through a bicycle master plan, when you look at above ground power lines, which is a whole other issue. But I think like what again, that's another thing that architects deal with a lot is how we're going to integrate with power, and I think and we, in my view, like there's a lot of space inside of our roads that are dedicated to moving vehicles around. Um, are there any paths or ways that you have seen helping city entities communicate with each other to coordinate those plans? Because I think like the take a bicycle master plan and a forestry master plan, and those two should sing, right? Like, and I think there's no reason why like introducing a tree canopy to an untreed street shouldn't be incorporated with a protected bike lane or something of that nature.
That's another layer. It's a great layer of analysis. I think when the city and whomever want to work together to figure out where best to activate kind of citizen tree groups or funding for tree plantings, they should do as much mapping overlay as possible. And I think a bike map overlay with a lack of tree canopy could start to highlight and illuminate where that comfort is already like required needed, where people are and where the canopy isn't. And I think that you'll find a lot of Venn diagrams throughout the city where there'll be an obvious need, an obvious hole.
Setting ourselves up so that buildings and trees that we want to last for generations like aren't going to be in conflict with each other, right? So we're not chopping off half of a tree and trying to save it and keep, and kill things when we build something or run our power lines right through it. Because that to me is tragic when you go down the street and they've just, you've seen the Y of a tree, with power lines running through it. It makes a big difference in the way a space feels and the way it's occupied. You create disconnections in a city when we do things like that.
That's one of those issues that causes a little bit of distrust or a little bit of fatigue in terms of those who are kind of caring for or advocating for not just trees but public spaces in general. Like when you see how top down some of the management and maintenance regimes could be, it's a little discouraging for those who are actually fighting for pollinator meadows to be kind of like to start to come up, or places where we maybe don't need to mow anymore. Richmond is full of these 18, I want to say 1860s, but it might be later. No, I'm wrong. It's more than the 1920s. The 1920s era terracing of the hillsides of Gamble's Park and Taylor Hill Park and Chimborazo. Those terracing have created steep slopes to the point where, yes, they were created and carved for the traffic of horse and carriage, for beautiful meandering vistas, and for kind of pleasure grounds and pleasure strolls, have now become not off limits, but overgrown and then unusable. So they're not ADA accessible. They're overgrown, and not to anyone's fault, just the way they were designed. And advance that design by 100 years, this is what you're going to get. But you have acres and acres of 45-degree angled hillscapes throughout the city, which could be in a way like intelligently redesigned or repurposed so that they are productive. They don't really feed into the footprint of our management systems, so we're not wasting, spending a big carbon footprint on the mowing that occurs on those sites annually. But you're putting in a big kind of capital improvement intensive project year one, and you're letting it flourish over the years. I feel that way about a lot of public spaces these days, like more and more actually, that there's so much input in terms of creating what we think is the kind of perceived public space. Um, but those spaces are very large, and if I encourage anyone, especially in the summer in Richmond, to go out to a green space and see how underutilized these spaces are. Um, I'm interested in that. I guess I'm interested in the volume of our public spaces and their usability and understanding, especially how parks of a certain generation like perform today. Um, I love this topic all up and down the East Coast. Richmond has it in spades. We're looking at a project in Philadelphia that's analyzing a 60-acre park and how vast some of the unused or even unusable spaces are. New York City, up and down Boston, we're looking at these spaces all over, and the story is kind of the same throughout. It doesn't change vastly with culture or climate. It's kind of the same in terms of the provision of these big public spaces, which were a heroic moment in time in terms of what cities were doing for their residents. I think that time kind of needs to be revisited right now, and it is being to a certain degree. But I'm very interested as a landscape architect in revisiting these storied, large urban green spaces and finding out what their next iterations can be.
One of Richmond's probably largest, I guess, natural green spaces is the river, and connections to the river are actually, I think, really challenging to find. If you know how to find them, they're there and it's easy. And my family uses them all the time. Like we're down at the river almost, at least every other weekend, if not more. And this is not the case for a lot of people. And I'm curious your thoughts about just access to the river in Richmond.
I think it's getting better. Um, I think the current leadership at James River Parks is incredible and doing a very good job at um, celebrating the park and bringing a lot of interest to the park through volunteering, through uh, just kind of corporate events. This is both the James River Park system and the Friends of James River Parks. Both do are kind of like this. Um, they're coming to it at two angles. One is far more engaged in the operations and management and maintenance of it, but also programs, educational programs, trail building, and expansion of the park through the work they've done at Dock Street Park and soon to be Mayo Island. Um, Whereas Friends of is really the public face and advocate of a lot of the work that they do there. And it's been really heartening to see that relationship kind of work to the benefit of the James River Park system at large. Access to it will continue just continue to be a challenge. It's like you take a city, you build a canal, you wrap it all in rail lines, and then you wrap all that in highways. It's going to be harder and harder to get to the river. But luckily, the interest is there. James River Park system and Belle Isle specifically is the most heavily utilized and visited park in the whole system of Richmond. And that should tell you something right there, because Belle Isle is one of the harder places to get to. So it's not that the interest isn't there; it's that there are more connections that the park will make and I think are anticipating making. It's just going to take a little more time, and I think the interest is outpacing the physical access to it, which is maybe why it feels like access is a challenge. But I actually think access it's there. It's just becoming a higher demand.
Tangentially related to that is the flood wall, and I think like I've well, so it is a barrier, literally. It's designed as such and functions, to be a barrier for people as well. It's also surrounded by parking lots and different things, so I see a lot of opportunity in some of those spaces too. Like, do you have any thoughts about activities and or landscape opportunities that might better serve some of those spaces and provide new ways to access, take something that functions as a barrier and see it more as a placemaking thing.
I guess in the same frame of the evolution of the riverfront being that there was the river, there was a lot more evolution than this. But in short, in terms of like what um, humans have done to it in the past 100 to 200 years, building a canal, building a hydro plant, building various rail lines that are now defunct or just the piers are left, bridges across, bridges in parallel, and railroads, and then the flood wall. All of those seek to demonstrate to the city that you don't face the river, you face your back is to the river, and that's not uncommon, right? Like the New York City, Manhattan's coastline for 100 plus years was all ports and meatpacking districts and slaughterhouses and fish markets. So there wasn't a public face to that. That's kind of the back, like the back of house was the river, and that's what it was in Richmond too. But that's clearly being reconsidered over the past few decades with what CoStar is doing with the amphitheater, with just like I said, with James River Parks providing more park space and acquiring more space as fast as they can. The human beings want to get back to the river in a way that is truly incredible. And this is not a new thing, but it's very palpable. And I think in cities like Richmond, it's becoming more and more present. And the pressures there, I think, on the city to try to work with advocates and whoever else is trying to make access to the river just more simpler. And like I said, James River Park, they're doing it. They're trying to create as much access as possible, but there are major barriers to that. And the parking lots, the big corporations that have their parking lots that are in the back of their building but are between their building and the river is a problem. Tobacco Row has all of their parking on the low line side, which creates a strange vacuum of space between the low line and the Tobacco Row buildings. Um, so yeah, a rethink of that is going to take some time, but it's something that I'm now pretty excited about since you brought it up.
I see a lot of opportunity there, and I think with the Capitol Trail cutting through there and connecting up through the further west, is generating a lot of life and connection in the city that I think is already there, even where there is a disconnection in the actual trail itself. People still may figure it out and use it, and it's always busy. Obviously, especially on a nice day, but people use it to commute. People mostly use it for recreation, I think. Those are spaces I think about a decent amount. Because to me, the opportunity is just right there. You wouldn't have to do much to take advantage of it. You just have to convince people not to park there anymore, and that's a challenge.
It's also it skews so heavily into the arena of recreation, the James River Parks system, and the recreation that you see is either in water or water adjacent or requires bikes or other kind of recreational elements that also require parking. And maybe to one of your earlier questions about equity, I think that's another thing. And I know I'm talking about these guys a lot, but I happen to really respect them. That the James River Park system does is education, and that's education not just in terms of ecology and kind of forestry, but recreation as well. So they're trying to get more people activated. They're doing a great job at it, bringing people to the river to ride a bike, to get in the water. And I think that those steps are the ones that need to be taken to just continue to expand the usership. And one of their main goals is conservation, and that the more they bring people to the park, the more they realize how precious the river and our riverine system is to the city of Richmond, which therefore kind of reinforces the idea of conservation, especially in an urban environment where it becomes problematic if it's not understood. So I think to those, I think I like this conversation because it's kind of grappling with the idea of access to public space just as much as public space design itself. because access is key for an equitable landscape, and that's something that the city of Richmond, I think, is working on, and I'm here to help kind of see that it continues to go in the right direction.
So, with regards to some of your comments about Belle Isle, and I know that you all have looked at that space and taken advantage of what's there in terms of the existing landscape and in terms of existing structures that have been abandoned and are both very cool and sometimes maybe dangerous or whatever. But I think I've only seen some of the diagrams that you all have put out, which have all been beautiful, by the way. But I think what can you say about sort of the approach to those projects? Because I think you're not Belial is a well utilized space. It's busy. It it's a great way to access the river that's open to the city. What are some comments that you have about working with sort of providing continued access and acknowledgement of the history of that space?
Yeah, we're going to put some more material out on Bell, the work we've done to date on our website. So I encourage people to come check it out. It's been one of the more rewarding um, design and just general kind of philosophical projects I've worked on in my career. It's a place that has so much recent history. Um, we had actually Jonathan Marvel, my firm's namesake, came to visit, and we took a stroll and trespassed in the hydro plant and climbed up on all the various kind of, like I said, dangerous structures. And yeah, he zeroed in immediately on it, which he kind of just closed his eyes and listened, where you can hear the same waters that were heard 150 years ago, the same rails screeching, the same bird calls, the same osprey. Like you hear the history just being on that island, and it's really powerful because it was the site of so many different um, cultural moments in Richmond's history, from pre-colonial to Native American uses for fisheries and hunting and scouting, to promontories for battles and encampments, to prisoner of war camps. I mean, you name it, it's happened on Bell. And more recently, just the amount of industrial that was built and abandoned in just the last 100 years. A lot of that stuff, like you mentioned and alluded to, is still there. Um, we and we at Marvel, I think, come to projects where if it's there, it has a story to tell, and so you have to find a really good reason to get rid of it. And if not, you better find a really fun way to repurpose it. And what we look to do is find a way to repurpose the various elements. The hydro plant, which is the structure that faces the dry rocks on the south side. Um, the rolling mill, which was a kind of a nail manufacturing shed and steel manufacturing shed um, along the mill race, which is just to the east of the hydro plant, which is currently just a single standing masonry wall. Um, the and the nail shed, which is the shed that's the structure. It's kind of two roof lines that flank the south side of Belvedere. Um, all those structures are still standing. They also all have, not all of them, but two of them have concrete foundations, and those are something you can't rebuild based on code and easements, but because they're there, they can be repurposed. So I guess what we saw in those spaces, and Richmond has seen these spaces and have used them in various ways for generations, but in terms of evolving program and creating what we're hearing, we walked Belle Isle a number of times, dozens of times with stakeholders, with just the public, just meeting and greeting people on the island, talking to them about what they like. One of the major overarching themes of what we were hearing was things like, this area doesn't feel safe. This area is overgrown. There's nothing for my 0 to 5 year olds to do here. They get really tired. They don't make it very far. It's kind of typical community engagement process we go through. But when we kept hearing things like that, and with equal measure of here's what we don't like, but here's what we love. We didn't touch anything that they love. Like we didn't. The only thing we took away from what was being sold is don't touch this because it's great for X, Y, and Z reasons. We would only just try to incorporate those reasons into elements that they felt were detracting from the experience at Belle Isle. So I think we just tried to kind of leverage what people love about it and not to mess that up at all, but only to add to it where it could be added to.